And now, Duncan Stroik joins Andy Dufresne. No kidding.
Oh, my Lord.
Stop.
Welcome back to LA
Cathedral.
Catholic Morning.
Oh.
Regular Friday morning guest. We always look forward to Duncan Stroik, who is a professor of architecture at Notre Dame. Good morning, Duncan.
Hey, good morning, Todd. Good morning, Michelle. It's great to be here.
I was super
Great
excited.
to go with you to St. Louis.
Yeah, I was
very-
very excited when I saw that this was on the docket because 19 years ago, I had the opportunity of going. And of course, as Michelle pointed out before we came on, this is the new cathedral that we're talking about, correct?
Yes, and 100 years later, it was finished in 1914. 100 years later, they still refer to it as the new cathedral. And like a lot of larger dioceses, they retained the old cathedral, and so that is now a co-cathedral. And so it's true in Baltimore, it's true in a number of places that you have these two cathedrals, the old and the new. 1914, the new one.
Now, how old is the old one? Do you know?
So the old one is a wonderful stone building right by the river, right by the port in old downtown St. Louis, 1834, little Greek Revival building, very fine, French architect, French people, of course. And then this is a much grander, probably holds 500 people. And then this is a much grander building edifice in every way and seats 2,500, 3,000. So the Bishop Kenrick in the 1870s wanted a bigger cathedral and thought he'd move uptown, move kind of like a lot of our stories, like St. Pat's, move uptown where people live, but it's not downtown, it's not so congested, and there's a lot of land, and so we have this magnificent Romanesque Byzantine edifice.
When we pulled up to it, Duncan, I love it when you pull up to a cathedral and immediately, before you even walk in, you're like, whoa, that is an amazing building. Like, wow. It just draws you into the numinous. And then when I walked in, I just could, I mean, I'd heard about the mosaics, but I was overwhelmed by them.
Yes. You really have to experience them, don't you?
Indeed.
Yeah, dude, let's talk about the outside of it, walking up to it. It looks like kind of an amalgamation of like a whole bunch of different styles. Am I right? It doesn't look...
That is very perceptive, Michelle. Yes, a lot of people have said that, and I think the short answer is yes, it's an amalgamation of styles, especially the Romanesque, and some qualities of the Byzantine. And then the interior tends to be Byzantine, like Venetian, like the East.
Okay.
So it is an amalgamation. But the architects, Barnett, Hayes, Newman, they believed, and many people at the time believed, that the Romanesque, let's say in the West, the architecture of the West in the Middle Ages, and the Byzantine, the architecture of the East in the Middle Ages, were at the same time and shared a lot in common. So this idea of a hybridization was very in style at the time, all over the world. And again, we talked about one of the buildings that you know well, which is Sacré-Cœur
Right.
in Paris on the hill, on Montmartre. So there's a whole movement in the 19th century for this amalgamation or this hybridization of styles. Not to be weird, but because they share a lot in common. And so to do something innovative and new, you look at different things and bring them together. And I think that's valid. But at first, this is kind of an overwhelming pile on the outside because it's got two towers and they're 120 feet apart, and then a big rose window set within an arch, very deep, and then a huge dome, 200 feet tall on the outside, and then these big, round, curving transepts. It's got a lot of sculptural quality, all made out of granite, all beautifully built. And the other part of it, and quite ornate, but the other thing that's interesting about it is it's unfinished, the exterior.
What do you mean by unfinished?
As you get close to it, you realize that those columns have capitals, and the capitals are not carved. And some of the detail work around the arches or around the pediments, around the gables, is uncarved, because in those days, when you brought the granite from the quarry to the site, you actually had it kind of roughed out in the quarry, but the sculptors and the ornamentalists would actually finish it right there on site. And so you have all these unfinished parts of the building that from afar look great. As you get up close, you realize, wow, they ran out of money.
I was about to say, what was the problem, Duncan?
I don't know the details, but like a lot of buildings, they ran out of money, and they did a lot. I mean, it's kind of one of the over-the-top cathedrals, and they ran out of money. And you'd think that, within the next 80 years, I assume this is before, the Depression or before World War II, at least, they never returned to finishing it. And modern people have said, oh, okay, well, that's what we did 50 years ago. Let's leave it alone. Whereas I think earlier generations, cathedrals in Europe would have said, oh, well, let's keep going. Come on, let's raise the money. Let's finish the job.
I have kind of a nerdy question. A lot of the cathedrals in Europe are made out of limestone. This one is made out of granite. This is, I hate to go geology on you, is one harder to carve than the other?
Yes, much harder. That's a good point. So we said that they left a lot of things unfinished, but also this is a much harder material. This is the same material that we saw last week at St. Paul in Minnesota, granite, which is considered by most people and most architects to be the finest building stone because it's so dense and so strong. And so often you'll see buildings built out of brick or limestone or other materials, and they'll do the base in granite because granite is so strong structurally. It's also fairly impervious to water, and in where I live, to things like salt. When people salt the roads and so on with the snow, you don't know what that is.
No, we don't.
But anyway, granite's a very strong material, and so we like to, and that's why we had this whole movement craze in the last 30 years. People have granite countertops in their kitchen because it can take a beating. It can take, wine dropped on it and lemon and so on. So granite is a great material, and the exterior is all granite and beautifully done, beautifully designed, but somewhat unfinished. And then the interior is not granite. It's really marble, various Midwestern limestones, and mosaic. I think of the whole interior as being made out of, let's say, stone and masonry. There's not a lot of other stuff of plaster, of wood. It's all kind of solid stuff.
Wow. Well, tell us about those little chips of glass that are everywhere, the mosaics. And I mean, it's almost raucous if you look at it.
It is. And to go into the history or the story of the mosaics is a story in and of itself. But they're glass mosaics, which is let's say the development of Christianity to make mosaics out of glass. The glass is fired to have color, and usually it has also color behind it. So whenever you see gold mosaics, it's actually a glass mosaic with gold on the back of it. Mm-hmm. So there's some depth, there's some, and so there's millions of little tesserae, millions of little pieces of glass, all put together into shapes that look like figures. They look like images. They look like angels and saints. And the basic idea is that they're trying to tell, on the one hand, if you go on the narthex, they're telling the story of St. Louis, which is the church is named after and the town's named after. So it's this great king who was very dedicated to his people and to his faith and to the poor. And then as you come to the church, you have, of course, the Trinity, Christ, the resurrection, the ascension in the kind of under the main dome, angels, the Beatitudes. You have Old Testament saints, Elijah going up to heaven, Ezekiel. You have, but you also have stories from America and from St. Louis. So you have American saints, and you have actually stories of different things that happened in the life of the faithful in St. Louis. So it's really telling a story. You could say salvation history, bringing it up to maybe the 19th, 20th century in America, bringing salvation history up to that.
Why would people make a stylistic choice to use mosaics versus painting? Is this just a style choice, something that someone had this idea to do these mosaics?
Okay, I'm glad you bring this up. One of the things that, yes, to me, this, at first glance, a Byzantine cathedral in St. Louis seems very surprising.
It does.
To have a little piece of Venice, the interior of the Venetian Cathedral St. Mark's in St. Louis seems, and it's bigger, seems kind of crazy. And then the outside is, okay, it's Romanesque-ish, and that was in style earlier in the 19th century, let's say 1880s. So this is kind of a little out of date, but we like that, and it's kind of massive and ponderous, but also beautiful with the towers and the dome. So one thing I'd like to point out is that there is a Byzantine revival. We talked about that a little bit, the Byzantine and the Romanesque. There's a Byzantine revival in Europe, and we see in Catholicism particularly, we see an interesting development in cathedrals. Marseille is one, and also London, Westminster Cathedral. Not Westminster Abbey, but Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic cathedral, is a Byzantine cathedral. And consciously going, kind of doing, I see it as doing something exotic, something that's Catholic but exotic, to stand out in the midst of prim and proper London. So the Catholics are trying to say, we're here, we've been here before Anglicanism, before Protestantism, and so we're going to give you something more ancient. And that kind of interest in this Byzantine revival and Romanesque revival translates to some examples in America all over. And this is the most famous, though. St. Louis is the most famous, and the point is they start this cathedral a couple of years after London. So this, Westminster Cathedral, and then we get St. Louis Cathedral, and then we get other beautiful churches around the country. So to answer your question, if we're going to do Byzantine on the inside, we kind of have to do mosaics. That's the expectation. It's all solid stuff. It's domes. There's 3 domes. Interestingly, on the outside, you only see one. There's 3 domes and 2 apses, or 3 apses, really, the 2 large apses, which have half domes. And almost everything is covered either with marble or with mosaic. And the mosaics are ornate, or they're angels, saints, Christ, the apostles, or great people from the history of Catholicism in America.
For someone like myself who was not schooled in architecture, Duncan, I'll just tell you it's breathtaking. And not even necessarily recognizing as was mentioned before, the amalgamation or the joining of the two. To me, it makes perfect sense that it's happening in St. Louis, where the arch is joining the east and the west in the country. This is almost joining the east and the west of architecture.
Yes, and we do believe as Catholics that Roman Catholicism is universal, and there's not one particular style for Catholicism. We love the Gothic, we love the Romanesque, the early Christian Basilica, which we see kind of influence upon the Mobile Cathedral, and the Byzantine is part of our tradition, and we can learn from all of it. In fact, when you go inside of this cathedral, you'll see, like many ancient cathedrals, you'll see inside 4 major chapels: All Souls, All Saints, Our Lady, and the Blessed Sacrament. And each one is slightly stylistically different with different language. And one of them is particularly Italian, and one of them is particularly Gothic. And there are other things too. So the Universal Church believes that it can encompass, all styles. And there may be even parts of different styles within this one church. And you definitely see that in the mosaics, because the mosaics were done over, about 60 years. And so there's quite a different variety of style, so that, probably most people are less fans of the stuff done in the 70s and 80s, which is more cartoon-like.
Yes.
But that's, it's normal. So yes, I think that's a good point, that Byzantine is part of our tradition, and we accept that, and we can learn from that.
If our listeners want to take a look at this, look at the Facebook page. They don't really have a good virtual tour on the cathedral page, but they do on the Facebook page. And one of the real opportunities that I like that this church presents is they do midweek music arias, midweek classical music, and you can go on and listen to one of the concerts. I think cathedrals are also beautiful public spaces for public events such as this, and they're still doing this in the time of COVID, but you can go on and look, and while they're doing the music, they show the cathedral, and it really is a very dramatic setting to it. So we are so lucky to be Catholic. I was recently in a Protestant church, and it struck me how different our spirituality is by what we simply look at. This Protestant church had nothing on the walls, nothing was ordained ornated. What am I trying to say? Anyway, but it was very, very plain where I go into the Mobile Cathedral or I look at this cathedral, and it is just it's an explosion for the senses. And we are so blessed to be Catholic and worship in that manner. Don't you agree, Duncan?
I do, and I want to thank you for having me on for St. Louis, because it's a near and dear place to my heart, somewhere that I was fortunate to do a little project in, and especially where one of my dear daughters was able to worship in for a year and a half.
Very
so
cool.
So much.
All right,
St. Louis.
Duncan, thank you. Look forward to talking to you next week. Up next, Father Andrew Jones with the Sunday Gospel Reflection in this LA Catholic Morning. This